Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of Truth is Justice. I've been thinking over the past few weeks about the possible reasons why certain information that is supportive of Sandra's defence is and has not been actively challenged or corrected by Bob on his show. Now, if the true goal was justice for Jim, then surely an important step in that process would be looking at the material relied upon by the person actually convicted of the crime, Sandra, and assessing whether it was actually factually valid. So whether you believe that everyone involved in the case was grouping together in a conspiracy against Sandra or not, in my opinion, it's vitally important to look at whether the claims being made by her and her family members actually stack up. Because if they don't, you have to ask the very serious question, why? So take for example the claimed stolen or confiscated rings, the claimed stolen TV, the claimed stolen guitar, and the lack of detail given over the life insurance policy. Now these are each elements where more information was known by at least Liz and arguably by other family members, yet Bob, Liz and other family members remained almost entirely silent on each of them, in the sense that neither Bob, Liz or other family members offered up anything in terms of clarification or information to point people in the right direction. So it follows then that either Liz didn't communicate to Bob the full story about each of those elements, or she did communicate the full story to Bob and all the factual details, and he chose to remain silent on them. Now, both of those scenarios present a huge problem with respect to credibility, and I believe that both scenarios provide an indication of the deceit and misdirection that was perhaps intended. Of course, some will argue that there is a third scenario, that Liz and family members didn't remember anything about the rings being found, that they didn't remember anything about the discovered guitar, that they didn't remember anything about the life insurance policy, and that they didn't remember anything about the TV receipt being obtained from a family friend who worked at the store 5 hours away. Now the problem is, as with most of the elements of this case, these elements were raised in one way or another at trial, so we're not talking about drawing on memories from 6 years ago. We're talking about drawing on memories from just over 1 year ago. So to me, the scenario that all of these elements that appear to undermine the argument for a burglary or just Sandra's general defence have simply been forgotten about by so many people so closely connected to the case and each of the elements is extremely unlikely. So let's look at each scenario more closely and see how it would play out. The first scenario, which is Liz not communicating the full story to Bob. And by that I mean not providing the full facts or the full details or correcting Bob when a statement is made that is known to be false and misleading. Now that scenario is concerning, as it demonstrates the possible intention by Liz and other family members to perhaps deliberately mislead people through silence, and even in some instances through the active participation in misleading discussions. And they did so with false information, where the reality was well known by Liz and others just over 12 months ago at Sandra's trial. Now, as I pointed out before, it could be argued, and it would probably be argued by some, that Liz may not have remembered some of those points, and to support that assertion, there are instances where Liz has noted that due to lupus fog, she's been unable to recall exactly what year it is. But the problem with that argument is the discussions of these elements took place over a period of weeks and months, and they involved multiple family members, some of whom were also aware of the facts and reminded of them just over a year ago. So also remember that it's been suggested many times by Bob and others that Liz and Sandra conducted their own intensive investigation into the events of that night in the weeks and months following Jim's murder. So to accept a failed memory by Liz in respect to many of those points, but to also then suggest that she has a perfect, almost photographic memory with respect to other elements is simply not consistent. And that leads us to the same situation we see over and over again. Apply an argument in one respect, but then entirely disregard it in another not so convenient situation. Now, examples of the withholding of information include the lengthy discussions on the Facebook page associated with Bob's show about multiple elements of this case. And take, for example, the wedding rings. I recall lengthy discussions on this and the suggestions by many that Sandra's wedding rings were either stolen or, as was discussed by so many and elevated to almost being a matter of fact, that the wedding rings were illegally confiscated by detectives out of some disrespect for Sandra and were never returned. Now we know that that simply isn't the case, but the damage was done by the true facts not being provided and by the clarity not being offered. Now, silence played an important role in ensuring that the seed planted supporting this broader conspiracy against Sandra was allowed to grow and flourish. And the life insurance policy, the actual existence of it and the amount of the life insurance policy was something of a mystery for many, including Bob, and it wasn't clarified for a long period of time. I recall various discussions about there being no life insurance policy to an overall policy amount of less than $50,000, and this took a long time to be clarified, and for many, it solidified that Sandra could not have had anything to do with the murder. And then we have the guitar, and the suggestions that it was stolen, and all the ongoing discussions about how expensive the guitar would have been, and even going so far as to lead some to draw a profile of the supposed burglar based on his or her taste in guitars. All of this when the reality is that Liz herself actually testified to the guitar being found. It wasn't stolen, and that was known the whole time, but it was never clarified because, in my opinion, doing so would remove an element of the burglary narrative that, at least for those connected to Bob's show, was a huge factor in proclaiming that Sandra's conviction was a wrongful one. And we also have the claims of the stolen TV. And even with the photos of the TV in the office being raised directly with Liz, there was no clarity provided on the model or make of TV claimed to have been stolen, or the model or make of TV potentially shown in the photos, by Liz or by any other family members. Now, it could be argued, of course, that neither Liz or other family members remembered anything about the TV. But in my opinion, that's very unlikely. The receipt represented something that they went out of their way to get. You recall they had to track it down at a store over 5 hours away from the Melgars' home. So in my opinion, it was important to remain silent on the reality of the TV and the details of it because, at least early on, that TV represented a key part of Bob's intruder and burglary theory, and it also represented a huge point of discussion on the pages associated with the show. Now to look closely at the second scenario, which is Liz telling Bob all the details and both Bob and Liz choosing to remain silent on them, or at least neglecting to reveal them when discussing those elements. And this scenario is equally concerning because it indicates to me a potential willingness to deceive people through silence or by not providing the full story, and by allowing discussions to be continued and in some cases actively participating in them through the provision of false information. This scenario also raises the question for me that once Bob received all the case material and presumably read through all of the case material, including the trial transcripts, what was his reaction to elements like the TV, the wedding rings, the guitar, the life insurance? Well, my opinion is that his views were silent. He didn't comment, and I believe that represents a serious problem with objectivity and a view to forwarding a cause related to justice for Jim. And more broadly, I've been trying to think of a single example of where Bob has challenged and corrected any element of Sandra's defence. And the truth is, I can't come up with a single one. Not one single element where an aspect of Sandra's defence has been undermined in any way. Even where the testimony from her own family has been clear, there has not been a single instance I can recall where that has been communicated. And for me, that's very telling. And not for the reason that Sandra's defence is wholly and utterly true in every single respect and therefore somehow entirely beyond challenge, but because the show, Bob's show, is entirely focused on the acquittal of Sandra, not justice for Jim. If the show were about justice for Jim, there would be no reason, at least no reason that I can comprehend, to remain silent or to mislead on elements that are supportive of a burglar scenario yet were known to be entirely invalid. I do completely understand that approach if the motivation for the show was acquittal for Sandra, but again, I just don't understand it if the motive is justice for Jim. In my mind, it just simply can't be about that. This week, we continue with the week-by-week analysis, and we move on to episode 606 of Bob's Show, which is the Friday follow-up episode to Mr. Carpenter's crime scene report. Now, Bob begins the episode by answering a listener question about why it's so hard to believe that home invasions happen when people are home and awake. And Bob notes that it isn't hard to believe, that it happens all the time, and that it is, in Bob's words, a silly theory to suggest otherwise. So let's have a closer look at the full picture though, rather than just touching on one or two of the elements. Firstly, yes, of course, burglaries happen when people are home, but they don't represent the majority. According to a survey by the US Department of Justice, someone is home approximately 28% of the time during a home burglary. But we have some other important factors to consider. A study conducted by University of North Carolina Charlotte researcher at the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, after randomly selecting 422 incarcerated male and female burglars, provides us with an insight into why some homes are chosen and what might deter them. In that study, approximately 83% said that they would try and determine if an alarm was present before attempting a burglary, with 60% then saying they would select an alternative target if an alarm was present. The study also notes the presence of people in the home would represent a deterrent, and the presence of dogs in the home would also represent a reason to select a different target. So what do we have at the Melgars home? We have a large, very noticeable sign in the front yard identifying that a home intrusion system was installed at the house. We also have the presence of dogs, who a neighbour testified would bark loudly when she entered her neighbouring backyard, and dogs who, it has been noted, had access to a doggy door and could have easily made their way into the backyard. And we have Jim and Sandra awake, and in an illuminated bathroom with large windows which would be clearly visible to an intruder. So simply saying that it wasn't a valid statement to make because burglaries happen when people are home isn't the full story. Burglaries that happen at night when people are home with dogs present and with an alarm system sign prominent in the front yard are simply not common. Far from it. They're unusual and they're not the norm. The second question Bob answers relates to where the dogs were when Jim went to let them in. And Bob goes on to note that it is known that the dogs were at the back door, which is where Jim was going to bring them in and secure them in the study. Now, we've spoken about this previously, but the reality is we simply don't know whether that is what happened. We don't know whether the dogs were barking, and we don't know whether Jim was going to the back door. That is just based on statements from Sandra and not supported by any of the evidence. And one brief point here, and it was a point raised in our Facebook group. Now, it's suggested by Sandra that the dogs were being moved by Jim from the back door to the study, where they would be secured. Now, the presence of the dining chair in the bedroom has been explained as allowing the dogs a platform to jump up onto the bed, as the dogs would sleep on the bed. Now, perhaps the arrangements were different that night, or perhaps the arrangements were different with the arrival of the puppies, but either way, the stated norm perhaps wasn't the actual norm at the time of the murder, and once again, it's something that has never been corrected. The presence of the chair in the bedroom is explained away as being normal, yet the fact isn't balanced with the dogs being prepared to be locked in the office. It's taking one aspect of the evidence that is supportive of an explanation, but then disregarding how it interferes with or is contradicted by other aspects. Bob then answers a listener question about the possibility that the intruders used a long stick or some similar object to manipulate the deadbolt via the dog door. And Bob discusses that method for some time, and with the door being made of glass, he indicates that someone could accomplish that with an accomplice providing direction as to where to move the stick to align it with the deadbolt. Now let's consider the actual scenario for a moment. Firstly, the dogs. Now that was supposedly kept in a barricaded area around the back door, so it would have been very obvious to any intruder. And as we've heard, a neighbour describes how the dogs would be alert to her being in a neighbouring backyard, so the presence of intruders in their own backyard surely would have triggered a similar reaction from them. And secondly, the lack of presence of a long stick or similar item. And we've got photos from inside the home and in and around the back door, and I can't observe any long stick or pole which would have served that purpose. Now the point I want to make here is that anything can be argued. Absolutely any angle is able to be argued in some way, but it requires something to confirm it, something that provides substance to the argument. If all you have is a theory not supported by any evidence, and at the same time there exists elements that seem to suggest that that theory would be unlikely, for example the barking dogs and the lack of a stick, then it really doesn't represent anything, much less a plausible explanation. Now Bob then goes on to consider the marks on the door, marks that Bob describes as tool marks, and then goes even further to describe the door as jacked up. Now Bob notes that it appears that someone tried to wedge the space of the door open. An example is given that a couple of screwdrivers and possibly a crowbar could have been used to achieve that. Now we've spoken about the back door previously, so I won't spend too much time on it, other than to say if you get an opportunity to have a look at the photos of the back door, please do. And take particular notice of the general condition of the inside of the door. And not just the marks, but the condition around the bottom and the edges of the door. In my opinion, it was not maintained in a great way. It was allowed to become a little run down. Now then take a look at the photos of the outside of the door, and also notice the lack of any marks or abrasions or obvious disturbance that would indicate that someone had used a crowbar, screwdrivers, or any other tool to gain entry from the outside. Note how it is offered that the marks on the inside were indicative of an intrusion attempt, yet at the same time the lack of marks on the outside of the door were ignored. Now this isn't Bob's fault at this point, as he doesn't appear to be aware of the existence of the photos at the back of the door from the outside at the time of recording, but we never get to hear an explanation for that contradiction, even when the outside photos are discovered. Once again, the full story, the full picture, provides clarity and just makes certain theories and narratives appear implausible and contradictory. A question is then asked about what appears to be some type of large black bag which is visible in the photos sitting close to the back door. And Bob takes the opportunity here once again to take a dig at Mr. Carpenter, suggesting initially that it appears to be a large duffel bag, and making the point that Mr. Carpenter didn't even make mention of it in his report. But then a couple of sentences later, Bob backs off on the duffel bag comment and suggests instead that it's possibly a dog carrier. But the problem once again is the damage in terms of framing Mr. Carpenter in a particularly negative way was already done. The idea that a large black duffel bag sitting next to the back door was not mentioned in a crime scene report is extraordinary. But the idea that a dog carrier in an area clearly dedicated to the dogs is not mentioned, but simply photographed, is far more easily explained. And the next area of questions covered by Bob surrounded the garage door, and Bob notes how it doesn't make sense for that garage door to be open. They, and to quote Bob, never used that door. But the problem with that is, the door was used. It's been stated that the garage door was used frequently by Jim when he was working in the garage. It may not have been used when entering and exiting by car. It couldn't be. There simply wasn't space on that side for a vehicle. It was used as storage. But the photos of the garage explain how it was used. The bags of leaves represent an example of how the door would be up to store the bags of leaves there. So when we go from never using that door to an actual situation where the door was used, and perhaps used often, it changes the nature of the scenario from one of mystery and suggestions of an intruder to one that's far more understandable. Now, Bob notes that all Sandra would have had to do was to tell the detectives that they used that garage door. But I disagree. I think they would have potentially created a number of questions that Sandra may not have been able to answer, and scenarios that Sandra may not have considered and may not have been able to respond appropriately to. So consider for a moment the situation where Sandra purposefully opened that door to ensure that upon arrival at the house, Herman and Maria and their family would have had a means and perhaps a reason to enter the house and discover her in the master bathroom closet. Now, responding to a question about whether the garage door was normally used then becomes quite difficult for her to assess. What would the following questions be, and how could it lead to contradictions? The simplest method to avoid those difficulties, and in the scenario where Sandra herself opened the door for the reasons stated above, is to state that she had no idea why it was open. And that's actually exactly what she stated. And Bob notes that it's his gut feeling that this case represented a getaway driver situation. He describes how the intruders may have began to stack stuff up in the garage and then have someone pull into the driveway, load up the car or cars with goods, and then drive away. And what's used to support that theory? The backpack in the garage. That's it, just the backpack. And what contradicts that theory? Well, the earlier statements made by Bob that the presence of the expensive flat-screen TV represented the theory that the intruders were on foot. Now, don't get me wrong, having a dynamic approach to how the situation could have unfolded is not just important, it's wholly necessary. The problem is when large leaps are being made in describing the potential scenarios without any factual basis for them. It's another example of the same tunnel vision which is so often attributed to others. It's applying the view that Sandra must be acquitted, and that any theory which supports that acquittal, regardless of how plausible it is, and regardless of the complete lack of evidence, it's still offered up. And we often hear the words, "it doesn't make sense," attributed to Ms. Barnett and suggested by Bob and others as being the basis of the prosecution's case. And the reality is a theory, a narrative, it must make sense for it to be valid. It must fit with the facts of the case and it must fit with the evidence. A theory can't just fit with one piece of evidence, it has to fit with everything, and it has to be consistent and not overflow with contradictions. Bob's then asked a question about Sandra's history of seizures and why the medical records don't seem to show that she was having them. And Bob explains this by noting that if Sandra had told the doctors that she was having seizures, she would lose her driver's license. So Bob notes that they would try to manage Sandra's seizures without going to the doctor, and whilst they were pretty much managed, they did still happen. And we'll discuss this more in upcoming episodes, but this once again represents an element where the actual factual reality was kept somewhat hidden from his audience. The physical and mental consequences of Sandra's seizures represent a significant element of her defence, yet Bob appeared to have very little information with respect to them, and at least didn't appear to be interested in finding out information about them. A question is asked about the Dateline NBC episode which covered the case, and asked Bob whether he is aware of any glaring factual errors contained within the program. And Bob says that with respect to Ms. Barnett, he takes point with some of the things she has said, and notes that he thinks there were factual errors there, and goes on to note that the big one is Ms. Barnett showing how Sandra may have been able to self-restrain. And Bob refers to Ms. Barnett demonstrating the self-restraint process by tying her wrists up. But Bob notes that this was an error because Sandra's wrists weren't tied up. And we've been over why that isn't right. You'll recall Herman's own account of what he saw, given to police just hours after finding Sandra. And we also have Sandra's own account of her hands being tied. Not her arms, not to her elbows, her hands. So what this represents is just the continuation of the theory that the binding didn't involve the wrist or hands, and it also adds another layer of attack against the prosecutor, Ms. Barnett, that once again isn't supported by evidence given on the very night that Sandra was discovered. Now, reference is made to an episode of Deadly Women, which featured on ID Discovery. Bob is very clearly upset with the material covered by the episode, and even makes the statement that what they are saying, being Discovery ID, is, "We are going to completely fabricate and make up a story because it seems more interesting." Now, I did find that comment quite interesting to hear. I guess one could certainly draw parallels. But the really concerning element comes a minute or so later when Bob provides a Twitter handle for Discovery ID, and whilst stating that he is not explicitly asking for people to contact them, he does highlight how they could, if they wished, let the producers of the show know what they think. Now, this is a tactic of Bob's which represents something of a pattern. Highlight and provide to the audience the contact details of a person or a group who has a different take on the case to him, and then whip the audience up into a frenzy to encourage them to take action through direct contact. Often, I expect, many take this action without properly analysing the underlying material for themselves. They simply take Bob's word for it. Over the coming weeks, we'll address some truly shocking examples of this tactic being used. Examples where more dedicated professionals are drawn into this theory of conspiracy against Sandra and without basis are unfairly and inappropriately attacked. Bob then goes on to answer a listener question about whether intruders could have seen the Xbox from outside. And Bob responds by saying they absolutely could have. But let's take a closer look at that, and I encourage you to have a look at the layout of the Melgar home to understand this better. The living room wasn't visible from the road or from the front of the house. It was located at the back of the house. There were windows across the back of the living room, but these windows had shutters which are fully drawn and appear to completely block the view into the living room. So aside from the fact that I don't believe the Xbox was positioned in that space in the cabinet, the statement that an intruder could have observed the Xbox from outside the home is entirely incorrect, at least that night. Now, some will argue that it may have been observed at an earlier date when the shutters were raised. And I suppose that's possible, but remember that would have required entering the backyard with the dogs and passing by the neighbours' windows without being observed. So the response given by Bob about the Xbox being visible, what it did was add more support to the intruder theory without a full explanation of the actual facts. A reference is then made to a listener question about how Sandra's soiled underwear was found, and how it confirms to the listener that it wasn't staged, with the listener noting that if Sandra really did do it, would she take it that far, noting that it adds credibility to her story. Now Bob agrees, and says that what level of commitment do you have to staging this, suggesting that the soiling of the underwear would demand a level of commitment perhaps beyond Sandra. And this is another aspect that I find intriguing, that the soiled underwear in some way, and to some people, confirms that Sandra was telling the truth. I suppose you could look at it a few ways. It could be that it was simply a result of being restrained for a period of time, even a short period of time, and having diarrhoea, which Sandra is noted as telling the arriving police officers and medics that evening. Or it could be something more considered. Now take three elements of the scene: the binding, the chair against the door, and the soiled underwear. All of those are reasonably easy to achieve, and all provide a powerful suggestion that you are innocent, and they suggest the involvement of someone else. If you've just murdered someone, would you consider soiling yourself going too far? I doubt it. Now, on a question about the cars, Bob takes the opportunity to get stuck into Mr. Carpenter again. He highlights his suggestion of supposed tunnel vision and supports that by saying that Mr. Carpenter didn't look at either of the cars in the driveway, adding a sarcastic "thanks a lot, Maurice," to finish it off. Well, the truth is, Mr. Carpenter did take note of the cars, and we do have photographs, lots of photographs. No less than 18 separate, specific photos of the cars in the driveway. Another dozen or so if you include photos showing the cars in the background and the photos of the car in the garage. This just represented another opportunity to attack people associated with the case, more firmly establish the villain, without anything really to back it up. A listener notes that after seeing the photos of the house, it doesn't appear to them to be ransacked. And Bob agrees, and says that the person is right, it doesn't look like a ransacked house. And Bob notes that typically in a staged scene, that is what you see, a ransacked house, stuff all over the place. And Bob notes that after talking to family, the house was not kept this way. Bob notes that if the crime scene was staged, it's the most brilliant staging of a crime scene that Bob has ever seen. And I'll make one point here, and it's something we've touched on over the past few weeks, and we'll address it more next week when we move on to the master bedroom, the master bathroom, and the two closets. My opinion is, I don't think there's been much of a staging here, but that doesn't mean I believe there was an intruder. All of the rooms so far don't appear to me to show anything demonstrating that an intruder was present at all in the home. But interestingly, where we do see evidence of an intruder, the master bedroom and master bedroom closet, and this to me is where it appears to be more overdone, in exactly the way Bob suggests a staging would be. We see wallets, purses emptied out on the bed, and that in itself is curious. I can understand an intruder wanting to steal cash, but why empty out the cards, scatter them, and then not take any of them? Think about it. What else would you be expecting to find in the card section of a wallet, if not for cards? Presumably that you're intending to steal. We also see picture frames knocked on the ground and other items, including medicine bottles, thrown around. We see what also appears to be trash from a trash can spread around the master bedroom closet. In essence, what we see with things like the picture frames and the wallets emptied out on the bed, trash on the floor, is exactly what I would picture would fit with a staging. And I'm no expert on that, and nor do I pretend to play one, but it is what I would take from movies and TV shows about how a burglary may appear. And grab a wallet and purse and scatter the contents on the bed, maybe knock over some picture frames and scatter some medicine bottles. But like I said, we'll cover that more next week. In finishing, Bob talks about how there's no mention in the report that it was Christmas time, and that for nicer neighbourhoods, Christmas time represented a prime time for robberies. Without offering up anything formal to support that, Bob notes that the prospect of gifts just laying around the home is enticing for intruders, but then goes on to note that the lack of Christmas lights in the Melgars' home, in fact suggesting that they may have been the only house in the street to not have Christmas lights, may have been a trigger for the intruders to rob them. Now, I don't quite understand that process of thought. On the one hand, it suggested that homes at Christmas time are a prime target due to the boxes of gifts being readily available to steal, yet at the same time, the lack of Christmas decorations due to the Melgars not celebrating Christmas made them a specific target. And that is where we will finish this week's episode. But before we go, I wanted to wish a very happy birthday to Ms. Roberta Glass from myself and all of us here at Truth is Justice. For those that don't know Roberta, I strongly encourage you to listen to her podcast, True Crime Report. Her interviews with guests are simply exceptional. The one with Isabel McFadden on Madeleine McCann was amazing, and her take on current events, such as the NXIVM case, is unbiased, and it gives you a unique insight that you probably won't get anywhere else. So search any of the major podcast apps for Roberta Glass, True Crime Report, and I assure you, you will not be disappointed. Next week, on Truth is Justice, we will look at the master bathroom closet, the master bedroom, and the master bedroom closet, and explain to you why so many of the elements you may have heard from Bob and others are just simply not reflected in the evidence. We look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice as we continue to set the record straight.